Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. For 6 years now, AJC has published the State of Antisemitism in America report, and each year the findings become more alarming and sad. This year's report found that 77% of American Jews say they feel less safe as a Jewish person in the United States because of the Hamas terrorist attacks on October 7th, 2023. A majority of American Jews, 56%, said they changed their behavior out of fear of antisemitism, opting not to wear a Star of David or put up a mezuzah. And a third of American Jews say they have been the personal target of antisemitism in person or virtually at least once over the last year. While the numbers alone are telling, the encounters with antisemitism behind those numbers are even more powerful. Here to discuss these findings and, sadly, his own family's experience with antisemitism in 2024 is Jordan Acker, a member of the University of Michigan's Board of Regents. Mr. Acker, welcome to People of the Pod.
Thank you so much for having me on such an unpleasant topic, but...
Despite the circumstances, it's a pleasure to speak with you as well. I want to tell our audience a little bit about what you experienced in the last year. Last May, the doorbell camera at your home showed a stranger with their face covered, walking up to the front door, laying a list of demands signed by the University of Michigan Gaza Solidarity Encampment, laid those demands on your front porch. And then a month later, your law office in suburban Detroit was vandalized with anti-Israel phrases, profanity directed at you personally. And then in December, you and your family awoke one morning to a pretty horrifying sight. So could you kind of walk through what you encountered last year?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting about this is that as much as I oppose BDS, I was not the person on the board who was speaking about it. The people that were speaking about it were actually my non-Jewish colleagues. We're an elected body, 6 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and universally we oppose the idea of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And we said so when we've reaffirmed this in 2018, we affirmed this in 2023. And at some point, while we had an encampment on our campus, it remained relatively peaceful to what other campuses had dealt with until they started showing up at our homes. We had this happen, a list of demands, ironically, including defunding the police was one of the demands. And then, it went to a different level when it went from all of my colleagues to just me getting the treatment. My office is an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. They went to my office in the middle of the night and spray painted messages all over it, including profanities, but they caused over $100,000 worth of damage. And I don't think that location was unintentional. I think that as people were waking up in that neighborhood, going to synagogue the next day, they wanted to make sure that people in that neighborhood saw what had been done. It was certainly on purpose. And what was so disturbing about it was that 3 student groups actually posted photos of it in the middle of the night on Instagram before the police knew about it, before we knew about it, and then quickly took them down, obviously, because, they realized this is a crime. And then things had remained relatively quiet through the fall. Experiences had been much different than prior semesters until I was awoken about 2 a.m. to jars of urine being thrown through my window. And this had followed several instances of similar incidents. On October 7th, the president of our university, who's not Jewish, his personal home was vandalized. The Jewish Federation in Metro Detroit was also vandalized. The head of our endowment, a member of law enforcement, all of their homes were vandalized with pretty much the same messages, ethnic related, calling them cowards, demanding divestment. Of course, the worst part for me was obviously the jars flying through my home. I have 3 small children, and having my oldest woken up to that was terrible. But they spray painted my wife's car with messages that said divest, but also upside down triangles, which I think most Jews now take to see as a direct threat. That is a Hamas symbol for a target. And as I've said before, I'm not in the Israeli military. I'm not a military target. I'm not a target at all. I'm a trustee of a public university in the Midwest. And this kind of behavior, frankly, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable from any members of our community, regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum. And frankly, it's deeply anti-Semitic. And the fact that there's some people that are questioning that or wonder why is part of the problem, part of why we've gotten here. It's a deeply troubling time, I think, for American Jews for a lot of these reasons.
You said that you are the only regent who has been targeted in this way. Any sense of why?
It's a good question. I think there's a few different layers to this. I think being Jewish is a big part of the layer, obviously. But also a part of it is that I have a public social media presence. It's something I've maintained since, frankly, when I was running for this office. This is an elected office, obviously, in Michigan. And I think that has something to do with it for sure. But the degree and the manner is very, very different. And it's really hard to understand why it would happen in this particular way. Again, except for, an excuse to engage in violent behavior. What's so disturbing about this, and what is so heartbreaking to me, is that I understand, for those who are on the other side of this issue, who, care deeply about Palestinian rights and Palestinians having their own state. I care about that. I'm the only regent that actually met with SJP prior to October 7th. Not because we agree on everything, we do not, but because there's some things that we do agree on. And by the way, the vast majority of American Jews agree on. I think that's what's been so disturbing about everything that's happened since October the 7th in America, is that you probably have no group of Americans that's more empathetic or sympathetic to Palestinians than American Jews. And yet there's obviously a large group of this protest movement, or the remains of it at this point, that are deeply anti-Semitic and are using Palestinians essentially as a weapon to go after and to isolate American Jews.
Are you the only Jewish regent?
I'm not. At the time, we had 3, actually, of our 8-member board were Jewish, but our board is almost universally pro-Israel and almost universally opposed to BDS, and has been for a very long time. And there are lots of reasons for that, but this is, perhaps the person who's been most outspoken about this, interestingly enough, is Denise Illich, who, if they were looking to attack a pro-Israel business, well, there are 2 Little Caesars locations on campus, right? Again, this has nothing to do with being pro-Israel. Coming to my office has a very distinct, very specific message that they're trying to send.
You said there are a number of reasons why the Board of Regents is universally opposed to BDS. Can you explain those reasons?
Yeah, well, I think the first one, and I can only obviously speak for myself on this, the board speaks through its pronouncements and its decisions. But the biggest one actually is that, generally speaking, academic boycotts do not add anything to the conversation. They don't get people closer to resolving conflict. They don't even get people talking about conflict. And to me, that's antithetical to the purpose of the American university. One of the incidents that has most disturbed me over the last few months, other than obviously the physical violence, but what's disturbed me is a group of mass protesters went to a lecture by a professor named Mark Dollinger, a guest professor on campus. And Professor Dollinger was teaching, as he does, about the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community during the Civil Rights Movement. And a group of mass protesters came in and said, "We don't engage with Zionists here." And what I've told people is actually the second part of that phrase is deeply offensive. But the first part of that phrase, "we don't engage with," is actually antithetical to the existence of the University of Michigan and should be tossed aside. We do engage. We engage with everyone, and we especially engage with the people that we disagree with. And so that kind of speech and behavior is, to me, the most problematic because, again, American universities are places where deeply unpopular ideas should be thrown around. That doesn't give it as an excuse for violence, but it certainly is a place for deeply unpopular ideas or for popular ideas or for anyone who's different than you. That's the purpose of this. And yet this movement has again decided that Jews or people who are affiliated with Israel are uniquely deserving of being tossed out. And it's unacceptable and it's un-American.
Is it just this movement, or has the campus climate been changing more and more in recent years when it comes to refusal to engage or the treatment of Jews on campus?
It's a great question. So what I think is that what has changed actually is not the values of the students. Because look, college students protest lots of things. When I was a student, BDS was an issue 20 years ago. What's actually changed is the faculty. And that's actually what's most concerning to me is the way that our faculty has behaved. Not all of them, and certainly not even a majority or a minority, but a small group has behaved since this happened. Throughout this process, throughout these protests, any criticism of the methods has been responded to by the faculty as criticizing everything about the movement. And so I think the faculty has actually, frankly, made the situation a lot worse. One of the things that I learned in conversations with other regents and other trustees across the country, and I'll never forget this story because it's so telling about where we are here. A person who's a professor at Columbia now was telling a story about how he protested the Vietnam War. And his mentor at Columbia, who was also opposed to the war, after they invaded Hamilton Hall, came up to him and said, "I agree with you on what you're thinking. I don't agree with what you're doing." And we've gotten to this place now, for some reason, that we can't do that anymore. That our faculty can't say, this is bad behavior, period, and deserves punishment, while we also may agree with the underlying politics. What has been most disturbing is that, for example, our faculty senate still hasn't condemned the attack on the academic freedom of Professor Dollinger, and only condemned the attack on what happened to my family after I called out the faculty senate chair publicly because she feels the need to publicly defend open anti-Semitism. And yet, when it comes to the safety of Jews, she's too busy. And it's really disturbing, quite frankly. And it's a disturbing reflection on our faculty. But I will say that since I pointed this out, I've had dozens of faculty members reach out to me and say, thank you. Thank you for speaking out about this. I don't feel comfortable either, but I can be fired. These promotion decisions come from this group of faculty. So what I would say is that there's real problems with the way faculty have been responding. And they're, unlike students, they're grown-ups. They're adults, and they don't, certainly I don't want to infringe on academic freedom, but academic freedom does not include the freedom from criticism. And they deserve a lot of how we've gotten here.
That's interesting that you heard from faculty who were grateful that you spoke up. And I'm curious, you said in an interview last year that since the October 7th attacks in 2023, many of us have been asked to distance ourselves from our Jewish identity. And I'm curious if you are hearing that from some faculty, if you're hearing that from students. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I will admit that I stole this phrase from Josh Marshall from Talking Points memo, is protest koshering, right? And that's a really interesting way, I think, of what has been asked of a lot of Jews, that Jews have to apologize for their heritage or for their love of the people of Israel, even if, like me, they don't like the government of the people of Israel, right? And that's, I think, been a big challenge. But what I've seen mostly is on our campuses, it's not so overt. It shows up in students avoiding certain classes, students avoiding certain professors, or students simply not speaking up at all. And again, those are really disturbing breaches of student academic freedom to have to choose, oh, well, I can't take this class or that professor, even if that professor might be good, because I might be judged differently, or I might have to listen to a completely unrelated lecture about the Middle East, or even worse, we've had professors, and frankly, they're mostly graduate student instructors, canceling class and encourage people to go to protests. It's an unacceptable place to be. And again, part of the issue here with the faculty is knowing where the border of your own political activism is and your taxpayer-funded job is, right? They're different. And we have to get back to a place where we respect both of those, right? We can't stop someone from going out and engaging politically, nor should we. But the person also has a responsibility to not bring that into the classroom, especially when it's not directly related to their class.
And so what specific examples have you heard from students and faculty In terms of wanting to hide their Jewish identity, are you hearing any examples of people who perhaps aren't wearing a Star of David necklace or aren't participating in Jewish events because they don't want to be identified as such?
I'm not seeing much of that, to be honest with you. And I think that's a great thing. I was really worried about this myself. I attended the last Shabbat dinner at Hillel prior to the end of the previous school year, and there were hundreds of students there, and it felt like any other Friday night. What I've gotten most from students is that they've been annoyed by it, but they haven't been overwhelmed. It hasn't been like UCLA or Columbia. It's like I said, it's been less overt. But I do think that there's been some level of people keep their heads down, right? And that's, I think, a big challenge and a big problem here. But I think it's worse among the faculty, far worse among the faculty than it is among our students. I mean, imagine being a Jewish or Israeli professor on campus right now and thinking that someone like this is going to be responsible for your promotion, for your tenure decisions. Those things are highly disturbing. And we see this all the time. Just last night, we see an epidemiologist who people want to protest because he's Israeli. Well, at some point it says, well, how is this person able to get a fair shake on their own academic research at our university if this is what happens every time, they're singled out in a way that, frankly, no Chinese student or Chinese professor would ever be singled out, because you would know that that would be clearly anti-Chinese racism. Somehow this seems to be acceptable when it comes to Israelis and to Jews generally. And it's not. And, it's a big problem in the academy, quite frankly.
You had also said in a previous interview that there has been an intense policing of Jews' ability to determine for themselves what is anti-Semitic and what is not. Is that one example? I mean, are people actually willing to say, oh, that's not anti-Semitic just because we protest him because he's Israeli or Jewish? I mean, is that what people argue, or are there other examples that you can share?
Yeah, I had professors come to me and say, how could you say what happened to your office is anti-Semitic? How could you say what happened to your house is anti-Semitic? And I think that, honestly, in a lot of places, it doesn't come from a bad place. I think it comes from a place of not knowing, right? And I think it comes from a blind spot. And I think that's really the big issue here, is that there's a real lack of education and interest on the far left with engaging with this. And I think it's, frankly, to say, oh, it's a failure of the far left is not actually doing the Jewish community generally a service. I think the Jewish community has also, quite frankly, failed when it comes to helping people on the left who are not anti-Semitic but have very real legitimate criticisms of Israel, helping them do so and engage in a way so that the conversations are productive while pushing out actual anti-Semitism, right? And that's, I think, a big difference. I think that we know, and we're very clear, and I know this having just come back from Israel about a month ago, that the criticisms of the Israeli government are quite harsh among other Israelis. And I don't think that stopping the Israeli government from being criticized in America is helpful at all either. I think it, frankly, deserves a lot of criticism, just like any other democratically elected government does. But it's the how. It's the what. Who's the messenger? How does the message come across? That I think things are really lacking, and people are really not understanding why it veers so frequently into anti-Semitism, and how to tell people, that language is not acceptable. The person who was the quote unquote head of the coalition that did our encampment put out a bunch of posts on Instagram saying that anyone who believes in the Zionist entity should die, and worse, right? The problem obviously is her own personal anti-Semitism, which is obvious. But more importantly, the problem here is that nobody says that's not acceptable. You're gone. Right? That, to me, is the biggest failure, because it says we are not policing ourselves in our own behavior, and it discredits movements. But more importantly, it shows what a utter failure this movement has been in order to get anything for Palestinians without hurting American Jews, which has ultimately been the target of so much of this.
I want to share more findings from the anti-Semitism report. The survey found that 81% of American Jews are able to divorce their displeasure with the government from their spiritual connection to Israel. In other words, they say caring about Israel is important to what being Jewish means to them. I think this perhaps is what you mean, or maybe it isn't, by a blind spot. I mean, is part of the problem on college campuses that lack of understanding about the American Jewish spiritual connection to Israel?
I think that's a big part of it. And I think that's a big thing that we're lacking when it comes to understanding the story of the Jewish people. But frankly, it's a story that could be told on the other side as well about Palestinian connection to the land and to the region as well. When we talk about where Jews pray, right, what direction we pray to, the importance of Jerusalem, the importance of so many places in Israel and of that spiritual connection, I think that there is a lack of understanding of that. One of the things that I got out of my own trip to Israel and meeting with Jewish and Palestinian students was they understand and they believe correctly, in my view, that the protest movement in America has simply Americanized a non-American conflict. This is not settler colonialism or some, academic theory. These are two peoples with very deep connections to this land who have a very, very difficult challenge in front of them. And it's different. And I think that, I think we have failed at that. I think the whole concept, and I've had this conversation with my friends in the Arab American community, the whole concept of not knowing that, they talk about the Nakba and this, ejection of Palestinians in 1948. And there is some truth to it. But what they don't know or speak about at all is the ejection of the Jewish communities that were also thousands of years old from the Arab world at that exact same time. And so I bring this up not to say that one group has more of a claim than the other, or one group has more of a claim for having suffered than the other, but to say that we need to talk about both sides of this narrative, and we're not. And, too much of this movement has brought forward Jews who say things like, as a Jew, I blah, 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 and I have no connection to the Jewish community or in Israel, or I don't know. But it misses out what the vast majority of American Jews say, and the vast majority of world Jewry says, which is they do have a spiritual connection to Israel. And it's fine not to, by the way. That's your personal belief. But there's been this mistaken belief that that viewpoint is representative at all of the Jewish community. And while it's a small group, certainly, it is not the majority at all. Most American Jews do have an understandable connection to the land of Israel.
Has the conversation on campus been a debate or discussion about the two people who have a connection to the land, or has it focused more on whether Jews have a right to self-determination?
I met with students at Tel Aviv University, Ben Gurion University, and Hebrew University, all three of which have very large Palestinian and Arab and Muslim populations. And they recognize the complexity of the conflict. And when I left there, my big feeling about this was deep embarrassment for the way that our students had. It's not all of our students, but a group of students had acted. This whole concept of genocide and settler colonialism, and it is completely removed from the everyday experiences and understandings of both peoples. I think that the conversation on campus has been wildly counterproductive. I think it has done no good for anyone over there, and it has only served to hurt people here. I think there's a lot of folks on the other side who genuinely believe that protesting is helpful for the Palestinian people and do not understand why these specific attacks are so harmful to American Jews. Again, I don't think the American Jewish community has done a great job in helping to educate and to push people into places that are not anti-Semitic. But I think generally the conversations have been particularly unproductive, that they just put people into camps and people are not able to listen and talk to each other because they use extremely loaded language and are looking for social media points. They're not looking for discussions and understanding.
Well, I will say that the State of Antisemitism in America report found that a majority of Americans, 85%, the same number of American Jews, agree that the statement, Israel has no right to exist, that foundational core of anti-Zionism, that statement is anti-Semitic. So I'm curious, does that give you hope that meaningful dialogue is still possible? It still could be on the horizon, or has that ship sailed?
I think no ship has ever sailed permanently. I think we're in a far worse place off than we were before October 7th. I think everyone is actually in a far worse place off. What gives me hope and understanding is that Jews are an accepted mainstream part of American life. And I think that's for a lot of Jews, myself included, there was a feeling that we were being intentionally isolated, that our allies weren't standing up and talking for us at the times when we needed them the most. But I think that it's pretty clear at this point that positions like that are a minority, that harassing my family and engaging in violent behavior, those are a minority. The group that called me first, the leadership of the community that called me first when this happened to me was the Arab American community in Metro Detroit, community that I have long relationships with, good relationships with. I've had the mayor of Dearborn over for Shabbat dinner. I appreciate and love those and cherish those relationships. But I think that it is totally separate from the question of Israel in whether Jews have a right to exist in America as full citizens. We're only citizens if we take certain positions. I think that's what, to me, that is most hopeful about, is it shows that that particular position is rejected by the vast majority of Americans. And I think that's a really good thing for American Jews at a time when world Jewry is in a pretty precarious state.
You mentioned that you have 3 young daughters who awoke to that vandalism in your home that morning. How are they processing all of this?
It's been really hard. I think trying to explain to a 9 and a 7-year-old why someone would do this to your family is really difficult. My 7-year-old said to one of her friends that there were people who were trying to bully daddy. And I guess that's true in the technical sense of the word. I think that that's right. But I think it's really a challenging thing. My girls are fortunate to go to great public schools with Jews and non-Jews. They're fortunate they do gymnastics in a very diverse community on the East Side, which we love. So they get to see and know people of all races, colors, religions, you name it. I mean, Detroit is a remarkable and diverse place. And to think that they were being singled out, I think is something that they can't quite put their heads around because it doesn't exist to them. For them, the Black girls that they do gymnastics with are the same as the Lebanese girls who they do gymnastics with, the same as the Jewish girls they do gymnastics with. It just, can you complete your round off, right? And that's, I think that's where I'd like them back to being again, but it's really, really challenging when you've had something like this happen to you, especially because the sound is so visceral and it's just so violative of your family and frankly of the way America should work. That's why I said at the beginning of this pod, it's un-American to engage in this kind of violence. It's the kind of violence that the Klan would engage in. And, that's why we have laws like here we do in Michigan to prevent people from masking in public like this. It's for this exact reason, because that's what the Klan did. And we have to toss it out because it has no place in our society, period.
Jordan, thank you so much for joining us and for kind of explaining the situation on University of Michigan's campus, but also your own family's encounter.
Thank you so much for having me. And for your wonderful CEO, I have to end this with a go blue. And thanks again.
If you missed last week's episode, be sure to tune in for my conversation with AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer, Jason Isaacson. We discussed President Donald Trump's stunning proposal for the U.S. to take control of Gaza and what it might mean for the future of the region. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.